7 extremely unsettling real-life serial killer movies that everyone should experience once. Throughout the course of history, there have been countless serial killers who have either gone unnoticed, escaped charges, or have managed to make a name for themselves because of the nature of their crimes. According to criminologists, a serial killer is someone who kills more than 2 people in order to gratify their psychological needs. Often these needs meet the criteria of abnormality and even include some kind of sexual contact between the killer and their victims. It was not until the 1970s that serial killers became a huge part of pop culture, thanks to the various documentaries, films, TV series, and books that were inspired from true crime stories. What makes their stories so chilling yet so fascinating is the complete disregard for human life and the lack of remorse with which they carry out their activities. Unlike a robber or a kidnapper who has the potential to kill, it is not easy to escape death when it comes to a serial killer because they want nothing more than to kill their victims. Another commonality seen is almost all serial killers whose lives have been studied is that they all faced some level of emotional, psychological, physical, or sexual abuse as children, which manifested into violent tendencies as adults. Many also indulged in petty crimes before they began killing, and more often than not, they lack any real motive to kill.
In control. Because this is the core to Ted!
Today, we will be counting down our top picks of films that were inspired from real-life serial killers and the gut-wrenching crimes they committed. Warning, viewer discretion is advised as the nature of this video is extremely graphic and may even be disturbing to some. Mention of rape, sexual assault, violence, murder, trauma, and animal abuse are explicitly listed, and extreme caution is advised for those below the age of 13.
Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
Man, you really creeped us out.
Number 1. Zodiac. The Zodiac killer operated from the late 1960s to early 1970s in Northern California, USA. To this day, the killer's identity remains unknown as the police were never able to decipher the clues they received. Although 3 main suspects were caught, the lack of evidence resulted in their release. The Zodiac used cryptograms in his letters to make them encrypted, and to date, only one of the 4 letters has been deciphered fully.
You were right, by the way. He didn't give his name.
Who cracked it?
A history teacher and his...
The killer claimed to have killed 37 people, but only 5 were confirmed to have been murdered by him and 2 escaped injured. The confirmed victims were aged 16 to 29. Although the San Francisco Police Department labeled the case inactive, it remains open in Napa County, Vallejo, and Solano County.
Who's that?
There's a greasesmith. Some cartoonist thinks he's going to solve the Zodiac.
In 2007, filmmaker David Fincher released his movie titled Zodiac, which starred Robert Downey Jr., Jake Gyllenhaal, and Mark Ruffalo. The film is an adaptation of Robert Graysmith's book of the same name and follows the case of the Zodiac killer closely. It opens on the 4th of July, 1969, where we see an unknown man shoot a couple, Darlene and Mike, in Vallejo, California. Although Darlene dies on spot, Mike survives. A month later, the killer, calling himself the Zodiac, sends encrypted letters to the San Francisco Chronicles and warns them to release the letters to the public unless they want to take responsibility for the blood of more victims on their hands.
He wants his code in the afternoon edition.
If the examiner doesn't have the balls to write, we scoop the bait.
Al, this man is talking about shooting 12 people.
Soon, after a married couple manages to decipher one of the letters, another murder takes place in Napa County, where law students Brian and Cecilia are stabbed to death. The killings continue as a cab driver is shot to death in San Francisco's Presidio Heights district, and his blood-stained clothes are sent to the Chronicle along with another letter. Inspectors Dave and Bill in SFPD get the case assigned to them and work alongside Napa Valley's Ken Narlow and Vallejo's Jack Mulanax. 2 years later, the police manage to arrest a suspect, Arthur Leigh Allen, based on the Vallejo case, as he is seen wearing a watch with the Zodiac symbol. After the handwriting expert claims that the letters were not written by Arthur, the police have no choice but to let him go.
No.
And the handwriting?
Ballistics no match, prints no match, writing no match.
Frustrated and unable to capture the killer for years, in 1978, Inspector Dave takes help from Robert, a cartoonist, as he seems to have a lot of information collected over time. However, Dave soon gets demoted due to allegations claiming that he forged one of the Zodiac letters. Inspector Bill also gets transferred, and Robert continues the investigation with his own limited resources. Soon, he realizes that Arthur, the first suspect, lived close to Darlene, the victim we see murdered in the very first scene. He also finds that Arthur's birthday matches that of the Zodiac, as the killer himself had provided it to the police as yet another taunt. Despite the large amount of circumstantial evidence, the police are unable to arrest Arthur due to lack of fingerprints, etc. Many years later, Robert publishes his book on the Zodiac killer. The survivor from the first attack, Mike, comes out to identify Arthur from a police mugshot. The final message from the film seems to point that Arthur passed away before he could be arrested, leaving the case open till date. Most of what we would have known about the killer's motives and his history died with the killer himself. However, based on partial deciphering of some of his letters, it seems as though his purpose for killing was nothing but pure thrill because he considered man the most dangerous animal of all, and the pleasure he derived from murder was better than what he could have derived from sexual intercourse.
How did you know he wasn't going to give his name?
Dangerous animal. Dangerous animal.
The Zodiac also seemed to be a staunch believer of the afterlife, and claimed that the people he murdered will turn into his slaves when he reaches paradise after his own death. It is possible that these beliefs stem from him having grown up in a religious family, but nothing can be said for sure. What made catching the Zodiac even more difficult was the number of copycat killers that sprung up as the killer gained more fame. It was becoming harder for the authorities to distinguish the Zodiac's victims from those of the copycats. In the last letter that the killer sent to the authorities, he claimed to have killed 37 people. He also tells them that he had watched The Exorcist and thought it was the best satirical comedy that I have ever seen. This further probes the question of whether the killer was someone who grew up lonely and perhaps found his muse in sharing his journals with the press and the police.
Who am I speaking with?
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Suspects that were thought to be the Zodiac but not shown in the film were Earl Van Best Jr. and Lawrence Kane K. Earl's own son released a book titled The Most Dangerous Animal of All, where he presented reasons and circumstantial evidence that heavily implicate his father as the killer. Kane was implicated to be the Zodiac by retired officer Harvey Rhines. Despite the few reasons that point at either of these men, Arthur seems the most likely person to have been the Zodiac. An old friend of Arthur claimed that he referred to himself as the Zodiac before the killings began, and that he was planning to hunt people with a gun and flashlight.
Messing with people.
You're positive he said Zodiac?
Yeah. I thought it was a stupid name.
Arthur even claimed that his favorite book was The Most Dangerous Game, which contained the quote about man being the most dangerous animal. Not only this, but a number of questionable items like bloody knives were found in his trailer, but they failed to discover anything that could link him directly to the murders.
Dead cat.
Well, I'm gonna dissolve it.
Huh?
And some acid.
Number 2. My Friend Dahmer. In 1978, when Jeffrey Dahmer, later known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was only 18 years old, he committed his first murder. After picking up a hitchhiker and taking him home for a few drinks, Dahmer seemed furious when the boy said it was time for him to leave. Dahmer then used a dumbbell to murder the hitchhiker, who looked around the same age as him. After he masturbated on his victim's corpse, Dahmer chopped up the body parts, skinned them to the bone, and spread them around the woods near his home. From that day, till he was arrested in 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered and assaulted at least 17 more people.
What about you?
Biology.
Great. You ought to pursue that.
Unlike most killers on our list, Dahmer was not subjected to any major trauma as a child, except for his constantly bickering parents who finally got divorced after he graduated from high school. Unfortunately, it was a few years too late as Jeffrey had already started showing red flags clear as day, predicting what he would become. His father, being a scientist, believed that Jeffrey's fascination with killing animals and insects stemmed from his curious mind. However, it was not long before Jeff shifted from dismembering animals to dismembering humans, claiming that he just wanted to see what was inside.
You need to get out. Get out of your shell, yeah? Something more normal.
Dahmer's mother was loving, but due to her history of mental illness, such as anxiety and depression, she was barely able to cope with the responsibility of becoming a mother. In addition to this, Jeff's father became more distant from his mother because of her ever-changing moods. The family also seemed to move from one place to another frequently due to his father's research. This made Dahmer a socially reclusive child who lacked friends and spoke mostly with a blank expression. Had these things not been dismissed as something as simple as him being a shy child, perhaps Dahmer could have gotten the help he needed at an earlier stage, saving his victims and their families a whole lot of tragedy. Later, as an adult, psychiatrists and psychologists were naturally taken aback by the actions of this killer, and many, till date, cite his crimes in their research papers. He was diagnosed with a combination of 3 personality disorders: schizoid, schizotypal, and antisocial, with the first one being the most prominent. According to the DSM-V, schizoid personality disorder can be characterized by a persistent detachment from social relationships and limited emotional expression in social settings. When growing up in a household filled with tension and fighting, most children tend to blame themselves for the rising conflicts between their parents. Jeff, too, thought of himself as the cause of familial issues and decided early on in life that he would never have a family of his own. With this long-term plan of never settling down, Jeff's actions only got more bizarre with age, until one day, he decided to take things to the next level.
There's only so much time left. I think with you as our fearless leader, we can really disrupt this school.
In high school, his strange behavior was once again dismissed as his peers started taking him for the class clown who was just enjoying messing around. His alcoholism began at the tender age of 14, which did not help either. At around this stage, Dahmer also realized that he was gay. He would hide in the bushes of parks where he would stalk young men jogging and fantasize about raping them. Due to the stigma surrounding homosexuality in the 70s, Dahmer did not see any other way out to be with another man unless it was non-consensual. Mark Myers' film titled My Friend Dahmer opens with a scene that shows him hiding in the bushes, and when he reaches high school, he catches the attention of one of his peers called John Durf Backdurf, who later went on to write a graphic novel by the same name. The film goes on to show Dahmer particularly obsessing over one jogger called Dr. Matthews. On finding out his identity, Dahmer books an appointment to be examined by him naked, and would later come home to masturbate to that incident. With his repressed sexual identity on one hand and his intense need to kill on the other, it was not long before the wires got crossed and he began to have necrophiliac fantasies. These fantasies soon took a fearful turn for the worse as Jeff began to act them out. Noticing how much of a struggle it would be to dig up a corpse in order to have sexual intercourse with it, Jeff decided to kill his victims and make his own set of corpses that he could have sex with. In one of the climactic scenes of the film, Dahmer almost brings himself to attack Durf and possibly kill him. However, he does not go through with it. The film ends with Dahmer picking up his second hitchhiker victim, who was never to be seen again. The film does not tell us a great deal about Dahmer's personal history with illness. Nonetheless, familial conflicts and the murders he went on to commit outlines the inner workings of a killer in the making, while Dahmer was in high school and in his formative years. As we know from research, Durf describes Dahmer exactly how he was: socially reclusive, obsessed with killing animals and insects, and becoming increasingly cold. Dahmer continued his pattern of drugging, killing, raping, dismembering, and keeping the skulls and genitals of his victims till 1991. He was finally arrested after one of his victims managed to escape and send the cops to his apartment, where body parts kept piling up till he could no longer contain the foul smell. Unsurprisingly, the police, media, and forensic experts were all shocked to find body parts, skulls, tools for dismemberment, and other horrific things inside. Dahmer was sentenced to 16 consecutive life terms in prison and was bludgeoned to death by one of his fellow inmates, who claimed that he did not make a single noise throughout the attack.
Fucking think I'm stupid enough to get back into a fucking car with you when there's a...
Number 3. Monster. Eileen Wuornos, who came to be known as the Monster, was the first recorded female serial killer of America. She murdered, robbed, and stole the cars of 7 men before she was sent to prison. Eileen justified her crimes by stating that she did society a favor by removing those people, or they would have committed atrocities such as rape.
Sending a raped woman to death! And you're a bunch of scum!
She also believed that the media wrongly termed her crimes as horrendous, as all she did was shoot them and leave them to die, rather than brutalizing their bodies in worse ways. Despite the murders that she labeled as self-defense, she later went on to ask for an execution. Eileen's history was nothing short of a tragedy. At just 6 months, she was abandoned by her mother and went on to live with her grandparents. She was beaten up regularly by her grandfather, who seemed to have anger issues, while her grandmother became an alcoholic. Some sources also claim that Eileen was raped by her grandfather regularly, and that he would often invite his friends to his house to participate in the abuse as well. Her father, who was charged with kidnapping and rape of a child, committed suicide while he was in prison. At this time, Eileen was only 2 years old. Due to her mother's absence and her father's decision to commit suicide, it is not clear whether Eileen had inherited mental illness from either of her parents. But seeing as how her grandfather was abusive and her grandmother clearly had issues that made her turn regularly to alcohol, it can be safe to assume that Eileen was a tragic product of her circumstances.
I don't even know her name because, of course, she doesn't have a resume out.
You don't need a fucking escort, you piece of shit!
Her life as a hitchhiking prostitute began when Eileen was only 15 years old. This profession is considered extremely dangerous for women, even by the standards of prostitution. Eileen, however, had no choice but to find a way to make money, as her grandfather had finally kicked her out after she was raped and impregnated at the age of 13. Needless to say, Wuornos went on to face more abuse in her life by the men who paid her for her services. She claims that her charging lower rates secured at least 4 to 5 customers a day, but despite the paid consent, Eileen was often degraded by the men she met. The cycle went on for years, and when she turned 33, Eileen decided it was time for revenge.
Come on.
See, I don't need a ride, man. Yeah, I don't need a ride.
Eileen admits that she was a victim in most scenarios, trying to make some money and resorting to murder when the men tried to get their way with her, without consent. But the state of Florida argues that Eileen posed as a helpless damsel on the highways, and the men who she murdered were only victim to their ill choice of stopping and helping her. Whatever the narrative, facts remain that over the course of 12 months, Eileen Wuornos went on to shoot 7 men, and she was not the least bit apologetic about it. After being abandoned by her parents and grandparents at a young age, matters were made worse for Eileen when her lover, Tyra Moore, came forward as one of the key witnesses in the case. Moore told the court that Eileen had confessed to her about the various murders she had committed, leaving Eileen feeling abandoned and betrayed once again.
If I was to leave this planet, it wouldn't be no big deal to me, because this is wicked.
Vexed by being labeled as a villain by the whole nation, Wuornos found herself a lawyer that would help her get to the electric chair sooner rather than later. This came as a perplexing shock, as it made no sense for a defense lawyer to be doing everything but defend his client. Eileen also caught wind of the fact that many producers were trying to cash in on her story by making a film inspired by her crimes. Determined to not let them exploit her name for their gains, Eileen could not wait for her trial to be over so she could be in heaven, while the police, judge, and lawyers could all rot in hell, as she puts it. In October of 2002, Wuornos was executed right after she uttered her last words, claiming that, like Christ, she would also be back.
I have to come clean and cleanse my spirit in the name of Jesus Christ.
Eileen has participated in numerous interviews, and her stories and narratives remain inconsistent in most of them. However, we do know that because of her upbringing, or lack thereof, she grew up to be a very angry person, who eventually began projecting all of her pent-up hatred on the men of the world. We do not have much information on her victims, except that they were all middle-aged men, but we do know that her first victim was a convicted rapist. It is possible that due to her history with rape and abuse, Eileen was telling the truth in claiming that she killed for self-defense, at least the first time. Eileen got in trouble with the law a lot between the ages of 15 and 33, while she was working as a prostitute, and before she made her first kill. Patty Jenkins' 2003 film Monster details Wuornos' story and stars Charlize Theron in the leading role. The film, along with Theron's outstanding performance, was deeply appreciated by the critics and was nominated for and won many awards.
You do it yourself.
Number 4. Henry. Portrait of a Serial Killer. Henry Lee Lucas was born and brought up by his mother Viola in Virginia, who was a sex worker and often abused him and his disabled and depressed father. He grew up with heavily skewed power dynamics at home, as his mother was not only the family's sole bread earner, but also physically more competent than his father, and would use that advantage to abuse the two. She would force Henry from a young age to dress up in female attire so she could pretend that he was her daughter. She would also service her customers in the house while Henry and his father were present. Soon, Henry's father's depression got the best of him, and he drunk himself to death. Growing up with such inappropriate exposure to sex, yet not having much authority or autonomy over his own sexuality, Henry's behavior started to take a turn for the worse as he got older. Initially, it mostly consisted of sexual deviancy, as he would kill and rape corpses of animals. But soon, he began raping his half-brother, who was much younger than him. Henry was also in and out of prison a lot, and at 23, he got into a fight with Viola, and she decided to not let him return home after he came out of prison. Henry stabbed her in the neck, killing her. Although he was sentenced to 40 years imprisonment, Henry got released much sooner due to prison overcrowding. After getting out, Henry was once again arrested, this time for an attempted kidnapping of 3 schoolgirls. When he got out, Henry went to live with his relatives who managed to get him a job, but he left because his new girlfriend's family caused trouble after finding out that he was abusive towards her. He spent the next few years of his life moving from one place to another. In 1976, when Henry was in his mid-30s, he met Otis Toole, a 29-year-old man in Florida. The two connected instantly and entered in a relationship.
Otis, she's your sister.
Okay, I was only kidding around, Henry.
Tell her you're sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Born in Florida, Otis Toole, like Henry, grew up with an abusive mother who would dress him up in female clothing. Toole claims that he was subjected to emotional and sexual abuse by his mother, sister, and even his neighbor. Otis's grandmother was no less bizarre than the rest, as she believed herself to be a worshiper of Satan and often referred to the young boy as the devil's child. His alcoholic father had abandoned the family when Otis was still very young. Until his departure from the family, he would sell Otis to his friends and neighbors so as to rape him and pay his father for it. He was subjected to this from the young age of 5, and by the time he turned 10, Otis came out to his family as gay. Needless to say, this led to more abuse and chaos, and soon, Otis dropped out of school and began working as a prostitute in gay clubs.
That little fucking bastard. I ought to kill him. I ought to cut his fucking head off.
That'd be a mistake.
Otis was already set to have a difficult life ahead of him, owing to his below-average IQ that often made people act out in ways that were not easy to handle. Even the most functional families struggle with someone who is born with a physical or mental disability. And so, Otis's abusive home life exacerbated things for him psychologically, that then goes on to prove deadly. Sometime in late 1975, a few months before Otis would come across Henry, he went on to marry a woman who was much older than him, later explaining that he did so to conceal his sexuality from the world. This seemed odd, as he was quite outspoken about it from a young age, and even indulged in professions that served his like. The marriage lasted 3 days because the woman inadvertently found out about Toole's sexual orientation, leaving him as a drifter, much like Henry at around the same time.
A phone call and get a gun. Anybody can get a gun, Otis.
What do you got in mind, Henry?
What do you think?
When Henry and Otis met at a restaurant and realized how similar they were, whether it was their interests or twisted histories, they felt a spark between them that led to the start of a relationship. After living like a seemingly normal couple for a period, Henry and Otis decided to go on a cross-country massacre, as they were too bored. To this deranged couple, the killing spree was the equivalent of a honeymoon, and Henry used the opportunity to teach Otis some things that he had learnt about murder.
You could use a gun. I'm not saying you can't use a gun, just don't use the same gun twice.
The two would kill whomever they deemed as degenerates of the society, hitchhikers or literally any easy target who had the misfortune of showing up on the couple's radar. Often the couple would mutilate, rape, or cannibalize their victims, and in later interviews, they claimed that they did not feel any remorse about their crimes. Shortly, Henry got tired of being with Otis. He told his lover that the right person for him would be someone much younger, right before he eloped with Otis's 12-year-old niece. Things went south for them as well, and Henry killed the young girl, chopped up her body, and littered it across the ranch where they lived. Still frustrated, he killed the ranch owner and stuffed her body parts down the drainage pipe. Meanwhile, a heartbroken Otis went on a killing spree of his own to blow off some steam, murdering 9 people. The two got arrested at around the same time. While in prison, they got back in touch via prison phone calls, and according to the guards that overheard their conversations, the two would often reminisce about the days they killed together. On being interviewed, Otis admitted to killing hundreds of people, while Henry confessed to killing thousands. The two began to enjoy the attention they were receiving from the media, as well as the public. In 2012, when Henry was 64 years old, he died from a heart attack. By reason of the constant vandalizing of his grave, the authorities placed him in an unmarked grave. Toole passed away at the age of 49 from cirrhosis and was buried at the State Prison Cemetery, as his body went unclaimed. John McNaughton's 1986 film titled Henry, The Portrait of a Serial Killer details the brutal crimes carried out by Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. The film starred Michael Rooker as Henry and Tom Towles as Otis.
I know you want your little theory to be true, you want to be on the right side, but sometimes you don't get to know if you're on the right side or not.
Number 5. The Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez terrorized the greater Los Angeles area and San Francisco Bay Area from 1984 to 1985. His crimes included abduction, murder, and rape, to say the least. Owing to Richard's upbringing, he is truly a product of the circumstances he faced while growing up. The constant psychological abuse that was unleashed upon him by his father turned him into who we now call the Night Stalker. Richard, his 4 siblings, and his parents had relocated from Mexico to Texas due to his father's change of profession from a police officer to a railroad worker. Although his father was a hardworking man who wanted to provide for his family, his mother and siblings often bore the brunt of his sudden bouts of anger as he physically abused them almost regularly. Richard had 2 accidents, one at the age of 2 and the other at 5, where he injured his head badly. Those injuries were not given much thought by his parents or teachers once they were treated, but later, Richard would go on to experience seizures and other psychological problems that had probably stemmed from his previous head injuries. In order to escape the toxicity of his home life, Richard soon began spending more time with his next-door cousin, Miguel, who had a profound influence on the young boy. Miguel himself was quite the sadist, and while he served in the army, he would rape and mutilate Vietnamese women that they had captured. He even showed Richard a picture of himself posing next to the severed head of a woman that he had raped and killed.
They were killed at the motel where I worked. Don't get all excited. Do you think I haven't been paying attention?
Rather than feeling like this is wrong or that his cousin may need help, Richard began to look up to Miguel. One night, while Richard was at Miguel's house, the cousin got into a fight with his wife and eventually shot her in the face, killing her. Although Miguel was arrested for his crime, little Richard experienced the whole thing firsthand. Still not wanting to go back home, Richard went on to live with his sister and her husband, but unfortunately for him, it was just jumping aboard one bad influence to another, as his sister's husband would indulge in voyeurism and take Richard along with him for the ride. By now, this young boy had been told ways to capture and kill, seen extremely graphic photos of the victims his cousin had killed, witnessed a brutal murder firsthand, and indulged in voyeurism with an older man. When Richard was in high school, he worked part-time in a hotel, where he tried to rape one of his guests. Seeing how the couple was traveling, they did not press any charges and Richard never got arrested.
Bad at me.
They call the cops.
No. They left town without pressing charges.
He soon dropped out of school, and at the age of 22, Richard moved from Texas to California. In 1984, Richard kidnapped a 9-year-old girl who he raped and stabbed to death. This was only the first of his many victims that would follow. Richard killed many people, including 79-year-old Jenny Vincow, 44-year-old Maxine Zazera, and 32-year-old Chanarong Kovananth. His victims had nothing in common, be it their age or gender, but his pattern of killing included robbing his victims, sometimes raping them before murdering them, and carving a pentagram on their palms. Richard killed at least 25 people between 1984 and 1985. In August of 1985, the police were able to catch one fingerprint of Richard from one of his stolen cars, which they used to obtain an ID.
Wilson made a decision. He's innocent for something that happened so many years ago. I mean, I just don't see how you can be so sure.
Richard was given a death sentence in September of 1989, but due to his good looks and trial by media, many women became infatuated with him. He received many letters from his fans who believed that he was innocent. He even went on to marry one of these fangirls who later broke up with him after realizing that he was, in fact, guilty of his crimes. At the age of 53, Richard died of ill health while he waited on death row. In 2016, director Megan Griffiths released her film titled The Night Stalker, which starred Lou Diamond Phillips in the role of Richard Ramirez. The film outlines Richard's life while he gets flocked over by his fans, proclaiming their love for him and Satan alike, as the killer waits on death row.
Sally, I hear something. Stop. Stop.
Number 6. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Some of the most popular films based on serial killers such as Silence of the Lambs, Psycho, and Deranged have been made on one man's gruesome true crime story. This man was Edward Gain, and he was the second born to George and Augusta in 1906, Plainfield, New Jersey. George and Augusta had a rough marriage before they ever had children. George was regularly physically abusive after getting drunk, and Augusta was always verbally abusive. Sometimes, their fights would become extremely violent, and Augusta was said to have gotten down on her knees to pray to God to kill her husband. Naturally, calling the couple's idea of bringing children into the world a bad one would be an understatement. Being a staunch believer in God and religion, Augusta made sure to keep her children away from everything she deemed sinful, and this included any women that was not her, as they were all whores.
But I just know some money-stealing bitch is gonna come along and try to take advantage.
Like most of the killers on our list, Edward was a reclusive child and did not have any friends in school, but mostly because he was afraid of his mother's wrath if he made any friends. Edward's only companion was his mother, and he was unnaturally close to her despite all the abuse she subjected him to. When his older brother expressed his concern about Ed's curbed social life, Ed managed to murder him and make it look like death by natural causes. With his father and brother dead, Edward was happy to have his mother all to himself, but tragedy struck when Augusta suffered a stroke which killed her. A young Edward with no social or life skills felt abandoned and alone. He was dependent on his mother, and he knew he would not survive the world without her. In 1967, a 58-year-old woman named Bernice went missing, and her body was later found in Ed's house by the police. She was found decapitated, hung upside down, and it was suggested that Ed had been draining her blood and her insides. This gruesome event led to the search of Ed's property, and based on the things they found, the house later came to be known as Ed Gain's House of Horrors. Human skulls turned into soup bowls, furniture covered in human skin, a box of human noses, a collection of dried female genitalia, cut-out faces of women, clothing made of human skin, and a belt that Ed created using nipples from women he had murdered were a mere number of those nauseating items. Ed confessed that he would put on his skin outfit to feel like a woman, his mother to be precise. He would target women who he thought had skin similar to Augusta, and would use their skin, their body parts, and their organs to surround himself with Augusta's make-believe presence. He even kept his victims' organs in his refrigerator along with their finger and toenails, tongues, and a human heart. Bernice's head was found with nails in it, as Ed had been planning to use it as a wall hanging later. Most of his collection was from the graves that his friends helped him rob, but not being able to work with skin of those that had died, he felt the need for fresh skin, leading him to kill. Gain was sent to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane after he pled not guilty for reasons of insanity and was deemed unfit to stand for trial. Years later, his house caught on fire for unknown reasons. It can be safely assumed that one of the townspeople had something to do with it, given how everyone hated what that house represented. In 1984, Gain died and his gravestone was robbed multiple times. He now lays in an unmarked grave. The 1974 film The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, directed by Tobe Hooper, gave horror film lovers the famous Leatherface. This killer's crimes were based off the story of Gain, and it was only one small addition to the long list of films, books, TV shows, and documentaries that have been inspired from this true crime story.
Got it right here.
Number 7. Extremely wicked, shockingly evil, and vile. Last on our list of some of the most brutal serial killers is the infamous Ted Bundy. Perhaps the most widely known serial killer due to the amount of data available online and the numerous adaptations of his stories on screen and on paper, Bundy was not just feared, but also someone who many women have romanticized over the years. The psychology behind women romanticizing killers is vast and perhaps a topic for another time. In 1946, Bundy was born to a single mother in Vermont. He was later adopted by his grandparents in Philadelphia and had a rocky relationship with his stepfather, who he seemingly despised. Ted displayed an interest in death and weapons like knives from a very young age. Although he was a good student, he was a socially reclusive child in school. Ted met his first girlfriend when he was in college and was heartbroken when she broke up with him. This had a deep impact on him as most of his later victims resembled the woman in appearance. Later in life, he met another woman named Elizabeth, who was a single mother and struggled with alcoholism. However, she claimed that Ted was always very warm and loving towards her. He had a charismatic personality, and in spite of being reclusive when he was young, he became more confident as he grew older. Due to his intelligence, charm, and good looks, Ted was often on the receiving end of female attention. This worked in his favor, as it helped him pick up women who he would later murder.
You could just put them on the floor right there.
In around 1974, many women in Seattle and Oregon started to go missing, and it would later be found that they were lured by Ted to a place where he could kill and dispose them. His pattern mostly involved him raping his victims, beating them to death, and then proceeding to have sexual intercourse with their corpses. Although Ted admits to having murdered 36 people, authorities believe that the real number is close to 100. His victims were young women in their late teenage years or early adulthood. It was Elizabeth who started to suspect that something was wrong and ended up taking her suspicions to the police. Some evidence she found in their home along with the regularly disappearing women helped cops arrest Bundy in 1975. Bundy was arrested when he was pulled over for not stopping at a traffic stop, and the police asked him to step out of his vehicle. In the car, they not only found the front passenger seat to be missing, but also a bunch of questionable items like a mask, ice pick, tools, and trash bags.
I know. I couldn't make your car. The headlights were in my eyes, and to be honest, I got a...
Even though he was released because the police did not find any evidence in his apartment, he was put under surveillance. On further investigation, the police found evidence that linked Ted directly to one of his escaped victims, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He escaped and was recaptured several times, but one of the times he managed to make his way into Florida, where he brutally attacked and killed 6 women.
Bundy jumped out of this second-story window at the front of the Pitkin County Courthouse this morning. Witnesses say he left.
In 1979, Bundy's long-standing trial came to an end, with him being sentenced to death. His was the first nationally televised trial, and while he waited in death row, he confessed to more murders that he had committed. Although many cheered when he was executed in 1989, many women continued to mourn the death of the man who they were infatuated with. In 2019, director Joe Berlinger released the film titled Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile, which starred Zac Efron as Ted Bundy. The film was based on Elizabeth's memoir titled The Phantom Prince: My Life with Ted Bundy, which details some of his gruesome crimes told from the perspective of his wife of 6 years.
And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.
Everything happens for a reason. Where there's life,
there's hope.